Part 1. The First Disappearance. The beginning of the 70-victim mystery. It was October 1978. A cold wind was moving through the streets of a small American city in the Midwest. The city was called Raven Creek. It was not a famous place. There were no skyscrapers, no major crime waves. Most people knew their neighbors. Children rode bicycles through quiet streets. Families went to work every morning and came home before dark. For years, Raven Creek had been considered one of the safest cities in the region, but that reputation was about to disappear. It started with an ordinary man named Daniel Carter. Daniel was 32 years old. He worked the night shift at a local manufacturing plant. Every evening, he left his small house around 7 o'clock. His wife usually expected him home shortly after midnight, but one Thursday night, Daniel never came home. At first, his wife wasn't terrified. She assumed his shift had been extended. Maybe his car had broken down. Maybe he had stopped somewhere. But when the clock passed 2 in the morning, she called the factory. Daniel had left hours earlier. His car was missing too. The next morning, she contacted the police. Detective James Miller was assigned to the case. Miller had been a police officer for 17 years. He had investigated burglaries, robberies, missing teenagers, and even several violent crimes. But something about Daniel's disappearance bothered him. There was no obvious reason for him to disappear. His wallet was still at home. His clothes were untouched. His family had no enemies. And according to his co-workers, Daniel had seemed completely normal that night. The police searched the roads around the factory. They checked nearby gas stations. They questioned co-workers. They searched empty lots and wooded areas. But there was no sign of Daniel. Then, 3 days later, his car was found. It was parked several miles outside the city. The driver's door was locked. The windows were closed. And Daniel was nowhere to be found. Detective Miller stared at the vehicle for several minutes. Something didn't feel right. But without evidence, there was very little the police could do. The case remained open. Weeks passed, winter arrived, and Raven Creek slowly forgot about Daniel Carter. Or at least, most people did. Detective Miller didn't. He kept Daniel's file on his desk. Then, in January 1979, another person disappeared. A 24-year-old woman named Laura Bennett. She had left a restaurant after finishing dinner with a friend. She told her friend she was going straight home. She never arrived. Her car was discovered the following morning. Again, there was almost no evidence, no obvious struggle, no witnesses, no clear explanation. Miller immediately remembered Daniel Carter. 2 disappearances, different people, different circumstances, but both had vanished without explanation. The detective opened Daniel's old case file. Then he opened Laura's. He placed both files side by side, and for the first time, he began wondering whether Raven Creek had a much bigger problem. But before Miller could prove anything, another person disappeared. Then another, and another. By the spring of 1979, the city was no longer peaceful. People started locking their doors earlier. Parents became nervous when their children stayed outside after sunset. Businesses began closing earlier, and rumors spread through the streets. Some people believed a gang was responsible. Others blamed a drifter. Some said the disappearances were completely unrelated. But Detective Miller had another theory. He believed someone was deliberately selecting victims. Someone who understood the city. Someone who knew how to remain invisible. And someone who had been watching for a long time. Then investigators discovered a strange detail. Several of the missing person cases had one small connection. A witness had seen a dark-colored pickup truck near different locations shortly before the disappearances. The description wasn't enough to identify anyone. Thousands of trucks looked similar. But Miller wrote the information down. He circled it in red, and underneath it, he wrote 3 words. Find this truck. That single note would eventually become one of the most important clues in the entire investigation, because Detective Miller didn't know it yet. But the disappearances were only the beginning. Over the next several years, the number of victims would grow. 5, 10, 20, then dozens. And eventually, the investigators would face a horrifying possibility. They weren't searching for several criminals. They were searching for one person. A person who had managed to remain hidden in plain sight. A person who would eventually become known by a terrifying nickname. The Hammer Killer. But in October 1978, nobody knew that name. Nobody knew how many lives would be lost. And nobody knew that the first disappearance had already begun one of the darkest criminal mysteries in Raven Creek's history. So, the 70-victim mystery. The dark pickup truck was still on Detective James Miller's mind. He had seen hundreds of vehicles during his career, but this one was different. Not because it looked unusual. It was simply because the same description kept appearing in different witness statements. A dark-colored pickup, usually seen late at night, near places where people had later disappeared. Part 2. The pattern begins. But Miller had a problem. A description was not proof. There were thousands of similar trucks across America. He needed something more. Something that could connect the cases. By the summer of 1979, Raven Creek had changed. The quiet town that once seemed completely ordinary now felt different after sunset. People started walking in groups. Parents became nervous when their children stayed out late. Some businesses installed new locks. Others hired private security. The local newspaper began publishing regular stories about the disappearances. The headline appeared again and again: missing. But nobody knew who was responsible, and that uncertainty was becoming more frightening than the disappearances themselves. Then came another missing person report. This time, the victim was Robert Hayes, a 41-year-old mechanic. Robert had closed his workshop shortly after 9 o'clock. A co-worker remembered seeing him leave. He was supposed to drive directly home, but he never arrived. His wife called the police the next morning. Miller immediately recognized the pattern. Another ordinary person, another disappearance, another vehicle that could not be located. Miller pulled out the old files. Daniel Carter, Laura Bennett, Robert Hayes. 3 different people, 3 different lives. But now there was something else. A witness near Robert's workshop reported seeing a dark pickup truck. Again. Miller stared at the statement. Then he looked at the previous reports. His suspicion was growing. Miller took a large map of Raven Creek and placed it on the wall. He marked every disappearance with a red pin. One pin, then another, then another. Soon, the wall was covered with them. At first, the locations seemed random, but when Miller stepped backward, he noticed something. The disappearances were not scattered across the entire city. They were concentrated around several major roads, routes that connected the industrial district, the older neighborhoods, and the highways leaving town. Someone knew the roads. Someone knew where cameras were almost non-existent. And someone seemed to understand how to disappear without attracting attention. As Miller wrote one sentence beneath the map: "This isn't random." A few days later, police received an unexpected phone call. A truck driver named Samuel Reed said he remembered seeing something unusual near an isolated roadside diner. It was around midnight. He had stopped for coffee. While leaving, he noticed a dark pickup parked behind the building. There was someone sitting inside. Samuel couldn't see the person's face, but he remembered one detail. The truck had an unusual silver stripe running along the side. Miller immediately requested a list of vehicles matching the description. For the first time, the investigation had something concrete: a dark pickup, a silver stripe, and a possible connection to multiple disappearances. Police officers began checking local vehicle records. But there were too many possibilities. The truck could have belonged to a construction worker, a farmer, a mechanic, a delivery driver, almost anyone. Miller knew the investigation could easily go in the wrong direction. So he decided to focus on one question: who owned a truck that had been repeatedly seen near the disappearance locations? Days became weeks. Then investigators found a vehicle that matched part of the description. The owner was a local man. His name was Evan Cole. He was 36 years old. He lived alone on the edge of Raven Creek. He worked odd jobs, and according to neighbors, he rarely spoke to anyone. Miller studied his file. No major criminal record. No obvious connection to the missing people. Nothing that would justify an arrest. But there was one strange detail. Evan Cole's pickup had once been painted dark blue, and along its side was a faded silver stripe. Miller stared at the photograph. Then he closed the folder. He knew they still didn't have enough evidence, but for the first time, the investigation had a name. Watching Evan Cole. Detectives began quietly watching Evan. They followed him from a distance. They documented where he went, who he spoke to, and which roads he used. For several days, nothing happened. Evan went to work, bought groceries, stopped at a gas station, returned home. He looked completely ordinary, and that made Miller even more uncomfortable, because if Evan was innocent, the police were wasting valuable time. But if he wasn't, the killer might already know that investigators were getting close. Then one evening, Evan suddenly changed his routine. Instead of going home after work, he drove toward the outskirts of the city. Miller's team followed. The pickup disappeared down an isolated road. The detectives stopped their vehicle several hundred yards away. They watched. Evan stepped out. He looked around, then walked toward an abandoned warehouse. Miller didn't move. He simply watched. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then Evan disappeared inside the building. Miller looked at the other detectives. Nobody spoke because they all understood the same thing. They might have just found the first real lead, but they still didn't know what was waiting inside, and they couldn't yet prove that Evan Cole was connected to the disappearances. The next morning, Detective Miller received a phone call. Another person was missing, and this time, the victim had been seen near the same road where Evan Cole had disappeared the previous night. Miller slowly put down the phone. Then he looked at the map. The red pins seemed to stare back at him. The case was no longer just a series of disappearances. It was becoming a pattern, and somewhere in Raven Creek, the person responsible was still free. Part 3. The truth begins to surface. The old notebook changed everything. Until that moment, Detective James Miller had been chasing a disappearance. Now, he believed he was looking at something much bigger. The notebook had been discovered inside the abandoned warehouse outside Raven Creek. Most of its pages were nothing more than ordinary notes, dates, numbers, and short handwritten sentences. But Miller noticed something strange. Several of the dates matched the dates when people had disappeared. Daniel Carter, Laura Bennett, and several other names that had never been connected publicly. Miller sat alone in his office long after midnight, turning the pages again and again. He placed Daniel's photograph beside Laura's. Then he placed the notebook between them. The dates were not random. Someone had been keeping records. But who? And why? Miller picked up the phone and called the police records department. He asked for every missing person report from Raven Creek and the surrounding counties during the previous several years. The answer shocked him. There were more cases than he had expected. Some people had disappeared from the town. Others had vanished along nearby highways. Some cases had been closed because there was simply no evidence of foul play. But now Miller wondered if those cases had been misunderstood. He spread the files across his desk. Then he noticed another pattern. Many of the disappearances happened within a short distance of the same highway. And that highway passed directly through an industrial area on the edge of Raven Creek. The same area where the abandoned warehouse stood. Miller leaned back in his chair. For the first time, the investigation had a direction, but he still needed proof. The next morning, Miller returned to the roadside diner to speak with Samuel Reed. Samuel had been one of the few people who remembered seeing something unusual on the night Laura disappeared. Miller placed a photograph of Evan Cole's truck on the table. Samuel stared at it. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he slowly nodded. "That's the truck." Miller looked directly at him. "You're sure?" Samuel took a breath. "I've seen that truck before." Miller asked where. Samuel explained that he had seen it several times near the industrial area. But there was something else. The truck wasn't always parked in the same place. Sometimes it was near the warehouse. Sometimes it was near an old service road. And sometimes it was parked near the highway. Miller wrote everything down. Then Samuel remembered another detail. There had been a small silver marking on the side of the truck. Miller already knew about that marking. It matched the description from another witness. Now the connection was becoming stronger. But while Miller was investigating Evan Cole, Evan seemed to realize that someone was watching him. That evening, Evan stood inside his house near the window. Outside, the street looked empty. But he noticed a vehicle parked farther down the road. It had been there before. Evan watched it for several seconds. Then he stepped away from the window. Inside the police car, Miller lowered his binoculars. He knew Evan had noticed him. The surveillance had become dangerous. Not because Miller knew Evan was guilty, but because he still didn't know what Evan might do next. Miller decided not to approach him. Instead, he followed the truck from a distance. Evan drove toward the outskirts of Raven Creek. Then he turned onto a narrow road leading toward the old industrial district. Miller followed. A few minutes later, Evan stopped near the abandoned warehouse. He got out. Miller watched from inside the unmarked car. Evan walked toward the warehouse entrance. Then he disappeared inside. Miller waited. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Finally, Miller stepped out of his vehicle. He entered the warehouse carefully. The building was silent. His flashlight moved across the walls. Then he noticed something he had missed during his first search. A small metal door. The mysterious key from the notebook suddenly made sense. Miller took the key from his pocket. He inserted it into the lock. It turned. The door opened. Behind it was a narrow storage room. There were old boxes, broken furniture, dust-covered equipment, and on one shelf, several objects that appeared to have been collected over many years. Miller didn't touch anything. He simply stared. Then he noticed a small cardboard box sitting beneath the shelf. Inside were personal belongings, a watch, a wallet, a photograph, and several other objects. Miller recognized one of them immediately. It belonged to Daniel Carter. His heart sank. Now he had something the case had been missing for months. A physical connection. But there was still no proof that Evan Cole was responsible. Miller photographed everything and called for additional officers. Before they arrived, however, something caught his attention. On the wall was a faded map. Several locations had been marked, and one of the markings was not in Raven Creek. It was hundreds of miles away. Miller stared at the map. Suddenly, he realized the mystery might be much larger than the town itself. The disappearances weren't necessarily isolated incidents. Someone may have been moving between different parts of the country. Miller looked at the old notebook again. The final pages contained several unfamiliar locations. He slowly turned the last page. There was one sentence written at the bottom. Miller read it twice. Then he looked toward the dark warehouse hallway. Someone had been planning something, and the investigation had just uncovered the first real piece of the puzzle. Outside, police lights began flashing through the warehouse windows. Miller closed the notebook. The case was no longer about one missing man. It was about a pattern that had remained hidden for years. And somewhere in Raven Creek, someone knew exactly what Miller had just discovered. It was about a pattern that had remained hidden for years. And somewhere in Raven Creek, someone knew exactly what Miller had just discovered. Part 4. The map that changed everything. James Miller stood beside the abandoned pickup truck, staring at the photographs he had just discovered. Each photograph showed a different person. Some faces were familiar. Others belonged to cases Miller had only recently found. He placed the photographs on the hood of the police car. Then he opened the old notebook. The dates matched. The locations matched. For the first time, Miller could see the entire pattern. The disappearances had never been random. Someone had been moving between different towns, leaving almost nothing behind. But there was still one question. Where was Evan Cole? Miller contacted police departments in the surrounding counties and shared the evidence. Within hours, investigators discovered something important. A gas station attendant in a neighboring town remembered seeing Evan's pickup truck. The sighting had happened only a few hours earlier. Miller immediately left Raven Creek. He followed the highway toward the neighboring town. As night fell, rain began covering the windshield. Inside the car, Miller kept the old notebook on the passenger seat. He knew he was getting closer, but he also knew that one mistake could destroy the investigation. When Miller finally reached the gas station, the attendant gave him a description of the direction Evan had taken. Miller studied the map. There was only one major road leading away from the area, and at the end of that road stood an abandoned roadside motel. Miller drove there. The motel was almost completely deserted. Its old sign flickered in the rain. Miller stepped out of his car and slowly approached the reception building. Inside, an old motel register lay on the counter. Miller opened it. One recent name immediately caught his attention: Evan Cole. He looked at the date. It was from that very evening. Miller called for backup. Then he entered the motel hallway. Room after room stood empty, until he reached the final door. There was light underneath it. Miller stopped. He listened. Nothing. He reached for the door handle. Then suddenly, the light disappeared. Miller stepped back. The door slowly opened, but the room was empty. Evan was gone. On the table, however, Miller found something: a single photograph. It showed Raven Creek. On the back of the photograph was a handwritten message: "You were looking in the wrong place." Miller stared at the words. Then his radio crackled. An officer reported that Evan's pickup had been found several miles away. Miller looked at the photograph again. He finally understood. The warehouse wasn't the center of the mystery. The motel wasn't either. They were only pieces of something much larger. Miller returned to Raven Creek before sunrise. He placed the photograph on the investigation board. Then he stepped back. The map was now covered with photographs, dates, locations, and connections. But one location remained unexplained. A small town several states away. There was only one mark beside it. No name, no date, just a red circle. Miller stared at it for a long moment. Then he picked up the telephone. He was going to find out what was there, because the case had started with one missing man. Then it became two, then several. And now Miller realized something terrifying. The disappearances weren't the story. They were only the beginning. The camera slowly pulls away from Miller's office window as the first sunlight rises over Raven Creek. The investigation board remains visible in the darkness, and beneath the red circle on the distant town,